moment, now only a minute from what we kids back then called blast off, and we're huddled around television sets to share the moment. And there at height of it all were astronauts Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins topped a huge Saturn V rocket, ready to be lifted by 7.5 million pounds of thrust on their way to a date with history. How did we do it? How did humankind 40 years ago, before personal computers, before the internet, before cell phones, long before iPods or high-definition television, back in those medieval times that young people today could not imagine suffering through, how did we manage to leave the home planet, journey 250,000 miles through the void of space, land on another heavenly body, step out and explore an inhospitable terrain, and return home safely? And to do that successfully not just once, but 6 times in a period of a little over 3 years. I mean, how was it possible? What did it take? And it happened during a very troubled time. The years in and around the summer of 1969 were plagued virtually worldwide by social unrest, wars, major strife of one kind or another. In such a difficult and even malicious time, how could one of humankind's greatest achievements have occurred? More likely, why didn't the Apollo moon landing fail miserably? These are some of the fundamental questions that I believe our speakers will be addressing in different ways during today's symposium. But first, why have a moon landing anniversary program here on the campus of Auburn University? What's the connection? Well, it's impossible to calculate just how much this university contributed to America's first moon landing back in July 1969, or to the Apollo program generally. At its peak, Apollo employed an estimated 400,000 Americans in government and industry in the universities. No one has ever tried to count how many of them were Auburn graduates, but no doubt there were hundreds, many of them graduates of our engineering programs, but also from the sciences, from business, and even from the liberal arts. Some of them I know are among the unsung heroes of the space program, individuals whose efforts on behalf of the moon landings were essential, if not glamorous enough to make any headlines. Much of the public's attention, of course, is always focused on the astronauts, which is understandable, since they stand at the top of the pyramid that is the space program. And Auburn is very proud of the 6 astronauts that we have produced that you see here on the screen. The top 3 of these Auburn astronauts played very active roles in the Apollo program. The bottom 3 came later and flew in the shuttle program. The Apollo astronaut from Auburn that we probably know the most about is 1958 graduate Thomas Kenneth Mattingly, who is probably more famous for actor Gary Sinise's depiction of him in the movie Apollo 13, but who actually flew to the moon and back as the command module pilot for Apollo 16 in 1972. Ken, or TK as he is known to his friends, comes back to our campus rather regularly. The last time this past March, when he came here to accept from NASA an award as an ambassador of exploration, the award being a piece of a moon rock which TK promptly donated to the university for us to safekeep and put on this public display. A second Auburn graduate who was part of the Apollo program was Henry Hartsfield. Hank, who is also still living, was a 1954 Auburn graduate in physics, and he became a NASA astronaut in September 1969, just 2 months after the first moon landing. Hank was a member of the astronaut support crew for Apollo 16, and then served as a member of the astronaut support crew for Skylab's 2, 3, and 4, all of which used Apollo technology. And here you can see the 2 of them together. Hank and Ken Mattingly flew together on Columbia as an all-Auburn crew back in June 1982 as part of STS-4, which was the last orbital test flight of the shuttle. and here you see them saluting President Reagan at the conclusion of their flight. Now, the other Auburn graduate who was an Apollo astronaut, unfortunately, is not so well known and did not live nearly so long. It was another 1954 Auburn graduate, Clifton C.C. Williams, who was killed in 1967 after a mechanical failure caused the flight controls of his T-38 airplane to stop responding. And that crash took place near Tallahassee, and C.C. was on his way home from the Cape to Mobile to visit his father, who was dying of cancer. Williams, a major in the United States Marine Corps, was part of NASA's third group of astronauts. He served on the backup crew for Gemini 10 in 1966 and had been assigned to the backup crew for the Apollo 9 mission. And if he had lived, this crew placement, and I've talked to Neil Armstrong about this, and Neil thinks this is what would have happened. The crew placement would have led Williams to being assigned as the lunar module pilot for Apollo 12, which means that he would have been part of the second moon landing team, and as such would have been the fourth human being ever to walk on the moon. Alan Bean got that position. I just wanted to remember in particular Clifton C. Williams this morning and to ponder just for a second how wonderful it would be if Clifton Williams had been able to be that fourth man on the moon and could be with us today for this anniversary symposium. Now, before I make the introduction of our first speaker, I'd like to thank several people who helped to make today's event possible. The first of those is Dr. Marilyn Laufer, the director of this art museum, and her staff for all they have done. This is a really nice venue for the campus and for an event like this. I also want to thank Dee Dee Dowdell and Teresa Whitman McCall and Cornelia Van from the Office of Communications and Marketing for everything they've done. Dr. Roy Hartfield, professor of aerospace engineering, who is one of our morning speakers, has given me a lot of assistance in coordinating the involvement of the College of Engineering, as has Jim Killian, who is engineering's director of communications. I also want to thank Daryl Crutchley, who's back in our back room, and for handling the podcast for this event. This event is being podcast right at the moment. So it's available now and will be available in an archived form on the internet. And I also want to thank our university president, Jay Gouge, for his support of the event, and he sends his regrets that he could not be here with us today. He really wanted to be. I plan to keep the introduction of speakers to a minimum today, but I will tell you one story about the trouble a person can get into when introducing a speaker. I was down in South Florida a couple of years ago. There's an organization down there called the Prologue Society. It's kind of like our OLLIs, our AU All People, the senior citizens getting together to hear speeches and sort of take classes. And so I was down there. It was sponsored by Northern Trust Bank. So I was going from one bank to another, giving talks about Neil Armstrong. I think I was in North Palm Beach for this one. And the bank president was introducing me. So he starts the introduction, and the first thing he says is that Jim Hansen grew up in Iowa. Well, I just thought maybe he had his I states wrong because I grew up in Indiana. And then he continued on, and all of a sudden he was introducing this internationally renowned and fairly controversial global warming scientist that Michael Griffin knows quite well, I think, Dr. James Hansen. He's been featured on 60 Minutes, and he's very, very well known. And so I was being introduced as this global warming scientist, and I thought, well, that's going to cause a problem because I know a little bit about that, but I certainly can't give a talk about it. And then he went right from the introduction of that James Hansen, as if it were me, to a proper introduction of me. So the aerospace historian in Auburn University, and so he was putting these two people together as one. And as I was walking up to the podium that day, I was, well, what do I do about this? I have to confess that this is not the proper introduction. I didn't want to embarrass the bank president. I think the secretary who actually got that information for his introduction was in a little bit of hot water. So you can get into some trouble with lengthy introductions, and I think as someone who has had some lengthy introductions, I think speakers really appreciate just leaving the time for them.